All right, for those of you joining us in person or online, this is our agroforestry panel. We have 6 panels, and we're going to start off by letting them introduce themselves. And the guiding question for this is you can introduce yourself, your background as it relates to agroforestry, any experience you have with agroforestry, and then why are you interested in agroforestry? So your name, your background, and experience. So we're going to start with Patrick here.
All right, hi everybody. Yeah, I'm Patrick Schultz. I'm an extension forester with Washington State University in Southwest Washington. And so I guess my background in agroforestry would be my master's work back in Michigan, where I'm from. Michigan State University did focus on agroforestry, specifically alley cropping. But coming out here, being a forester, I got into forest farming. I gave a talk yesterday on big leaf maple syrup production and log-grown specialty mushrooms. Also done some work with silvo pasture in the region, particularly with Mark. But I see a lot of opportunity in that region for sure.
I'm Margaret Peter. I'm a forester placing kids at Thurston and Pierce right now. And I have minimal experience with implementing agroforestry, but I have done planning work for people who are interested in incorporating that into their forestry operations. And I also grew up on a farm, so I have kind of 2 different perspectives on that.
Hi, I'm Terry Browsick, and forester at Snohomish Conservation District, and have a graduate certification in agroforestry from the University of Missouri, and have been running an agroforestry program at SCD for the past 3 or 4 years now here, maybe 4 years, working with a lot of different landowners. Just seen my focus being on these working, repairing buffers and applications in riparian spaces, and then something as well. And then running an agroforestry program, I get to dabble in lots of agroforestry practices, but reach out to other specialists in some of the other practices.
Anthony Waldrop with Grace Harbor Conservation District, and I work on a number of watershed restoration projects in our area that involve and discussions with both landowners and agencies around the vision of those riparian areas. And so as part of those discussions, we have talked silvopasture and other sort of agroforestry techniques. And so we're still in the early stages of implementing agroforestry techniques, but there's a lot of interest and potential in our area, especially with these riparian restoration projects that have a lot of fun throughout the state.
Hello, my name is Lauren Healy. I'm with Thurston Conservation District. I'm a senior habitat restoration specialist there. So what I do is identifying, designing, collaborating around riparian and floodplain restoration projects. So that is sort of my nexus here. I'm really interested in kind of the spaces of how do we deal with the edges of riparian buffers and how do we create multi-dimensional projects. So a lot of my experience is in its really early phases. I'm in planning silvopasture projects right now, and have more experience with things that ended up looking a lot like silvopasture, sort of incidentally, and sort of designing the woodland system and things like that. So I can put some here, but yeah, I'm here.
Nick Schneider, farm planner for Mason District. Before I was a planner, I had for some years of orchard management experience, been lifelong craftsman, sucker, sheep grazer. So about 10 years of maple syrup production, and so I really here for that district. So actually easily one of the 91 questions that the landowner planners see a lot of winter confinement and woodblock. That and that's available for purchase, so we just see a move cattle in and, you know.
So the format of this panel is I have a list of questions. We're going to try to get those through those as efficiently as possible. And then I'm going to turn it over to the audience, both in person and online, to see if you have any questions. So we'll start with Nick on the far end here. If you could highlight an agroforestry project you've been working on, public or private lands, and tell us a little bit about that project.
So one we've been slowly developing, pursuing funding. It's another winter confinement. Urban area near, somewhat near our shellfish growing zone. Nice that project and we also have a use area, smooth fencing, facilitate livestock movement. It's pretty really awesome. They're in units, so there's clear sediment, erosion, runoff risk, you know. On the pipe, but we're trying to.
Cool, thanks. So I'm working on designing a large illustration project with a team of folks that's down in the Scoop County, and it's on a large fourth generation cattle ranch, and there's a lot going on that farm, which is really exciting. There's some and narrow creek restoration buffers that have been installed on that property. And we're lucky enough to work with a great landowner there who's interested in this context of silvopasture. So what we're looking at is essentially a seasonally wet, rotationally grazed area where cattle are completely out of that space during the wet season, and floodwaters are sort of allowed to come through that area naturally, which is wonderful and sort of the best setup for success that we could ask for. And then we're sort of building off of what we would consider like a traditional no-touch restoration buffer that's immediately adjacent to the river, and looking at how we can incorporate some of those ecosystem services, some floodplain roughness in that seasonally grazed area, and looking at silvopasture systems there. So one of the sort of exciting things that we're exploring, we're in the conceptual design phase right now, this project, is sort of alternate ways to arrange the silvopasture in those areas. Traditionally, you would see rows, and that's usually to both facilitate maintenance but also harvest. And this particular landowner is really motivated by providing shade for his animals. He really sees that as a limiting factor for him. His property happens to have a few existing stands of mature trees, and those trees have provided for both like regrowth of the grass underneath them, but also just how beneficial the shade is for their organisms and how much they really crave that and are increasingly hot and dry summers on the west side. So we are actually looking at exploring a cluster formation that's a little bit more natural and fenced circularly, which will be really exciting to explore. We're still, narrowing out the details of what that will look like, but that's what we're pursuing right now. Yeah, we're looking at just native species and no harvesting here. So it's kind of an interesting intersection there where we've got sort of highly managed understory for grazing. The trees there, native species, and then this cluster system, but still maintained over
So one of the projects, or a couple of projects involve large scale engineered logjam placement on the Satsuma and riparian revegetation in those areas. And these areas are important for the landowners, largely motivated by the risk from erosion in these areas. 50 to 100 feet of erosion perpendicular to the stream each year. And so a lot of them had riparian buffers and they went away. This restoration program is has an opportunity to come in, slow the erosion with bioengineering and reestablish riparian buffers for the long term. So within that context, we the funding program priority was to establish as big a riparian buffer as possible. It's an aquatic species funding program. The landowners, lots of different priorities. One of the big ones, reducing erosion, and some other ones were, maintaining the working lands, cattle grazing, haying. And so as part of our discussions with those landowners, we, and as an opportunity to expand the potential riparian habitat, was the concept of silvopasture. And very similar to what Mara was talking about, the concept we explored with these landowners was 50-foot clumps of fenced native vegetation, trees and shrubs, and in between each of those clumps spaced throughout the landscape. Grazing and also protection of that riparian sort of no-touch 50-foot circles, at least no touch for the first, and the livestock wouldn't impact them as much. So those were parts of the discussions. They showed up on concept plans, and then as time developed and we got more and more in-depth discussion with landowners, it ended up dropping off the plan. For one landowner, it was he didn't see as much of a benefit in the potential shade. And it just wasn't he's got plenty of shade throughout his property in other forested areas, so it wasn't a big benefit to him. And from the funding agency side, like they were, the way they saw silvopasture was they didn't really see it as a riparian benefit, unfortunately. They saw it as almost window dressing, and we were really trying to say, like, no, this is a really potential, benefit to have this multi-use area. So but because the landowners weren't as interested, that one dropped off there. Another area we lost from design to implementation, another 300 feet of potential plantable land. So that landowner's buffer shrunk, and willingness to plant a buffer down to sort of the minimum behind the engineered log jams. And then another landowner ended up selling his land. He was really interested in silvopasture, but because of the rate of erosion, he sold the land to a land trust. And so that property is getting planted to a full riparian buffer, not silvopasture. So we had opportunities, interested landowners, but I think in these, especially these erosion, high risk erosion areas, where even if you get the silvopasture established for a number of decades, there's the potential for, or a high potential for that erosion to get there. Projects is large wood that can be contributed to the system and stay in the system. And so it makes it difficult to do an investment. When I was thinking through Carrie's presentation, to do an investment of fruit crops or nut crops, where the ultimate like the healthiest ecosystem there is for trees to fall in and have that function. And so I think there is a role in some of these larger naturally erosive landscapes, but it might take more of a under like the berry harvest in riparian forest, or the flash grazing concepts in more. We're kind of reconsidering what that will look like in those areas, but then we have smaller creeks where we can do the more intensive crops with the trees as well. So it's been a really good learning process, and I'm really excited to continue to develop planting plans with landowners around these concepts and break down that misconception by a lot of state agencies and funders that it needs to be no touch.
And as you plant more of these systems, get some research in there. So. Yeah, so I've been doing similar work, working with a lot of riparian buffers and getting work systems into those buffers. And then working with a farm on some alley cropping, which has been interesting. A more traditional alley cropping type system where he is growing cider apples and then cutting hay and growing hay in between those rows of trees. So we've got a SARE grant working with him to collect data, soil health data, and forage data, things like that, production data. And so that's been an interesting one. Lots of small landowners. I have to say, because I run an agroforestry program, we just have so many landowners so interested in all kinds of practices. And of course, being on the west side, our farms are very small. And so lots of ingenuity and creativity in the systems that landowners want to try out or design. Lots of different types of, I know we have Mark talked about that narrow definition of silvopasture, but lots of different types of silvopasture type systems with all different kinds of livestock, ducks, chickens, pigs, pigs. So yeah, lots of different interesting agroforestry practices that I've gotten to be a part of.
Okay, so I work with Nick, so what he said, but also, I guess I'll expand more on some of the more landing, forest planning type of things that I've been working on. In our area, we do get a lot of interest about silvopasture, and yeah, that mostly comes in kind of two sides. One is more of a salvage situation where there's already been livestock in the area, and they're trying to, they obviously notice that there's a problem. They're not forage there for the animals. They want to try and improve that. And then the other situation is, the existing pasture they have is just not enough, or it's an integrated condition. So one of them was a area where the only pasture they had was along the stream side. It was basically a lot of reeds and sedges and stuff that the cows didn't really want to eat. So the plan there was to create somewhat of a rotational system through a chunk of the forest that he did have, and convert from all forest use to basically creating strips of forage area that they could then use. Some of the downside of the planning is there's not always the implementation funds there to do it, or the landowner willingness to follow through on that. So some of that would we have to come back and check in with those people to see if they're still interested in doing. The other request we get is people who are interested in permaculture, so getting more into that forest farming, trying to create those types of gardens in the forest. And so a lot of what I do is kind of tell them what won't work with the trees there, and say maybe that's not the best idea, or maybe those plants wouldn't really work under a canopy, but trying to create some kind of a plan that they would then still be interested in pursuing, and still kind of do the best thing for those trees that they would survive long term, while also being able to introduce those other crops in there. So kind of a variety.
So I didn't really mention this in my introduction, but I'm really focused mostly on education and outreach. I'm kind of the odd duck here. I don't get to go out and do the planning piece and carry projects through to implementation, at least not as much as I'd like to. But I certainly touch a lot of projects. I end up feeding a lot of folks to conservation districts and then back and forth from there. But so I guess true to form, I'll touch on a couple of projects that are really based on that education and outreach, demonstration and research component, which I think is just so critical. There's a landowner I met in Lewis County about a year ago who just bought this huge chunk of land on the Newaukum River. And for lack of a better phrase, he gets it. He really, like, based on kind of Carrie's last talk on working riparian buffers, he came to me expressing this notion that it's just these no-touch riparian buffers are not going to succeed. And I want to do something on my property that expresses this idea that you can have a working riparian buffer, whether native species or non-native species. And I think he's going to end up focusing more on native species in the end. So this guy, he's really spearheading it. He's working with WDFW to try to get funding and just kind of appropriate this concept, make it approachable, that we can be interactive with our riparian buffers, and that's critical, right? Because it's better to have a buffer that has human interaction than just reed canary grass, because ultimately that's what it's going to be. So I'm really excited about that project, and he's fully on board for workshops and field days, research, demonstration, and I think that's really key because that's how we get good adoption ultimately. And the other project I'll talk about is going to shamelessly plug my demonstration forest in Olympia. If you heard my talk yesterday, it's a forest farming demonstration there that focuses on bigleaf maple syrup production and log-grown special mushrooms. We have some research trials there, and some of that's actually run by the University of Washington. But there's a lot of other opportunities there for this biocultural restoration. This forest is highly degraded on this property, so there's a lot of work, a lot of opportunity. And I think there's opportunities to work with tribes around first foods, using that as a restoration tool, again, focusing on that long-term human interaction. So I'm really excited about how that'll play out over the next, 5, 10, 20 years, maybe more feasibly. But just a lot of opportunities there for outreach and education, and really good relationships conservation districts along the way. I rely on you guys a lot to plug me in with those landowners that are willing to do this kind of stuff.
Okay, so our next question is twofold. So, and you all have talked a little bit about these already, just as far as challenges and successes with your agroforestry projects. But if you can speak to what challenges do you see around adoption of agroforestry practices, and what successes have you seen in agroforestry projects? So challenges that you see for adoption, successes that you've seen with ongoing projects.
I get to go first.
It's too hard to reach anybody.
So I'm just going to say what I just said over again. Because I really think the biggest challenge, Mark touched on this a lot in his talk about how people are out of state for resources. And all of these examples for agroforestry, they're drawing from the Midwest and the Northeast and the Southeast. And certainly there's some capacity to translate those and be effective, but it takes a lot of expertise. And even then it's still a little bit of a stab in the dark. So we really need a lot more research and demonstration going on. I think the only way that we can really get landowners to feel confident that something is going to work is by them seeing it. The other piece of that is we need enterprise budgets and tools, things that can actually tell landowners it's going to take this amount of labor, this amount of product roughly, and this is what you'll get in return. It is a financial investment. We need to be, I hate economics. I am not an economist or an agronomist. I don't have the mind for it, so we're gonna have to hire someone else. But I think it's so important that landowners be able to look at those numbers because it is financial for them. Some people are doing this out of the goodness of their heart, but I think for most people, it's got a return on investment, and it's really important to be thinking about all that.
big points there.
Yeah, sorry, guys.
I guess to kind of expand on that, having those tools available so people know what it costs, people know the effort, especially that it's going to take, how much maintenance time is going to go into this, whether they're able to spare that time from, their other jobs or the other rest of the farm, or other, and making sure that, they're willing to commit to that if they're going to start on that. It's kind of a terrible feeling to get halfway through something and realize you're not going to be able to finish it. So making sure that, we're prepared from the outset to follow through on that. And then, I'm going to steal one from Carrie from earlier, is that there is a lot of pushback on, the regulatory, groups that, maybe this isn't something that they are willing to look at yet, as far as actively managing buffers and things like that, and the types of harvesting that would happen, as well as food safety around selling products from these unconventional farming systems that our food safety rules haven't really caught up to that aspect yet.
Yeah, all good points. I think to build off of all of that, I think there's challenges and opportunities with funding. I think funding can be very challenging for agroforestry practices, and I think agroforestry is relatively new in the Pacific Northwest. And so Mark also touched on the fact that there's not a lot of local research in agroforestry systems. There are practices that are well defined or established come out of the Midwest. So that's part of the a challenge, but also opportunity that we have and that we're trying to work through, is getting more of these practices established on farmlands, documenting what good practices look like in Washington State, in the Pacific Northwest, documenting what our economics look like. I think another challenge with these systems is that this is a different type of farming than maybe a lot of our farmers are used to. Agroforestry systems are dynamic, very dynamic, and they change over time. So it's not going to be the traditional straightforward, every year I till and then I plant and then I harvest type of system. And your crops may even change over time, depending on what type of agroforestry system you have. And that can be a challenging concept for many landowners to wrap their heads around. But I also see potential, and I see success, and I see opportunity, because in my area, in the North Puget Sound, climate change, and farmers are starting to note things happening on their landscapes, and they're starting to know the challenges they have with the farming that they are doing. The farming that farmers do now is challenging in a lot of ways. And there are a lot of farmers that are coming to me, old school farmers, multi-generational farmers, farmers that have been dairymen their whole lives, and their grandpa was a dairyman and their dad. And they're saying, they're coming to, there's a lot of groundswell for changing, and a lot of interest in changing, even by some of our old school farmers, definitely by newer, younger farmers, but even by some of the older, old school farmers who are like, gosh, what I've been doing just isn't working. Doing the dairy thing anymore is just not panning out, or cutting the hay is not paying the bills, and I've got to try something new. And they want to try higher value crops. They want to try systems that are going to be a little more resilient to changes that they see on their landscape. They want to try silvopastures so that their cows or sheep have some shade, and they can extend foresee them. So I do see, yeah, while this type of farming has these inherent challenges, there is this groundswell of interest and this want to explore and try new things.
Yeah, great, great points everyone so far. And I'd just like to reiterate that importance of the locally specific agroforestry resources because of how regionally different agroforestry can be. Went to a great agroforestry conference out in Spokane a couple of years back where I met a number of you, and it was some really great examples around windbreaks and snow breaks, and it's just like, yeah, I don't need that in Grace Harbor. And so it's I'm excited for a lot of the projects that Mara's working on, Carrie's working on, Mason CD are working on, because the more examples we have, the more I can gather together farmers from our area and do a field trip, and we can talk about market opportunities. And so just that's going to be the most important part of creating a snowball effect of adoption of something novel. I think one particular success is that the mention of agroforestry techniques piques the interest, and we haven't gotten one across the finish line yet, but there's interest, and with that, they understand the potential, and so I think it just is going to take time to find that right fit. So that's really great that there's that interest. As far as a challenge goes, I think the focus in sort of our funding world on, especially in the salmon recovery, riparian world, on acquisition and sort of no touch zones as being the highest value for a public dollar spent on salmon recovery makes it so that when we're pursuing projects and keeping a private landowner on that land, it might get fewer grant points or be seen as a less, because that land isn't going to a land trust or going into something that's permanently protected. So that's an uphill battle that we're fighting, is like, no, we're trying to create a culture of stewardship. We're working with landowners who have a really high, they steward their lands really well, and trying to build that community locally and work with the tribes and make sure that we aren't just locking up land with land trusts that may not have a community basis that allows for interaction with that land. So that's something that we're working against, is trying to change that culture around, oh, acquisition. This is the best way to spend the public dollar for salmon recovery. Changing that culture a bit.
So I think for me, a little bit more practically, some of the challenges that I see in conversations with landowners, questions that come up pretty immediately are around some of those maintenance pieces. Practically, how do we do that maintenance? How much work is it? Similarly with fence management, that's something that if you talk to any cattle rancher at any size, it's like, please don't make me build any more fences. They don't want to maintain them, and especially in we are in a floodplain, that the damage that those floodwaters can do to fences, that's a whole other headache. So that is one thing that is definitely a challenge to adoption that I see. I think that the sort of long-term, so oftentimes my sort of nexus here is coming much more so from the riparian restoration side of things. So folding in those restoration techniques and folding in the sort of like long-term maintenance element to silvopasture systems. I was really excited by Carrie's talk and sort of thinking about some of the potential for overlap between the idea of having humans in place as an intentional maintenance practice and sort of the overlap there between like harvest and maintenance. So that was something that I'm thinking about as well. I think one of the big things that Anthony alluded to as well is just ag viability and sort of this perception when we're working on larger projects that we're, especially on the restoration side of it, that side of things, coming in and removing land from agriculture. And I see one of the big opportunities and successes that I've had with silvopasture systems is the ability for these projects to change that narrative a little bit and say, yes, we are providing these ecosystem benefits, but we're also not precluding future ag uses. And in fact, we're setting up a system that will be really suitable for silvopasture and grazing. Should a future landowner purchase this property and wish to graze it, which is a really different sort of mindset and shift. So that's a success that I've had. And then again, just that concept that I mentioned before that I'm working on, where we're sort of revisiting landowners who already have a more traditional riparian buffer installed on their property, where there is already that CREP style buffer, and saying, you know, how would you be interested in expanding this out? And sort of starting from that baseline where, especially when you have some level of trust and relationship and rapport built with the landowner, and they sort of understand the systems that we are working in and the funding structures, and saying, okay, what can we do next? And that we have a bit more flexibility once we're sort of on the other side of that no-touch fence. So that's one of the sort of successes that I see there.
So biggest challenge I see out of the things previously mentioned, funding. Difficult for implementation without having local convincing. Practically for a landowner, Mason is an extremely county where travels fast. So a lot of the landowner intake I do comes from just conversations. Heard about what I've done for so and so and wanted to know if that would work for me. So with that also comes a long-term management. Say we're doing silvopasture. We've talked about how we follow that through, make sure we're following. That with the actual barrier to entry on logistics, taking a working pasture as it is, additional fencing costs, additional planting, trees are cheap, it's a protecting of those trees. We're actually looking at our newer technologies with electric netting. Cheap producers and producers to be able to work in those alleyways. Comes out with these virtual fence barrier there, but that gives that landowner the flexibility to properly manage with especially in flood plans. I guess success story. You know, we've been able to provide landowners with sometimes somebody just wants to go out. But you know, we're there for that too.
Can I just a little tangent, sorry. Just in hearing some of the buffer talk, the working buffer talk from colleagues here, just because you remove humans from restoration does not equal success. I just want to state that there are great successes with riparian restoration, planting out systems and removing humans and walking away and having those systems be great and functional. And then there are many cases where you go and plant a system and you remove humans and that system continues to degrade. So yeah, I just had to state that. I just had to get that off my chest because they're, really, even if it's just a full native riparian buffer, having intentional management in there, especially when you're dealing with species like Japanese knotweed or reed canary grass or some of these, having, going in, planting and coming back once a year to maintain it, doesn't always equal success. Sometimes having humans in there interacting is the more successful approach. Okay, thanks.
Changes are necessary. No worries. So the next one is around interagency cooperation. So the question is, how would you like to see, or how would you see? Sorry, how do you see, or how would you like to see interagency cooperation? So that could be NRCS, conservation districts, extension, university. What would your ideal be there, or what have you seen that works well?
Us being here, kind of working together. I've communicated with both Patrick and Mark about some past year questions in the past, and are very encouraging for us to reach out. I've worked pretty closely with NRCS in our county, and really happy with where it's at. We have good communication, sometimes based on our nature of, the confidential aspect. More willing to share with us than they are with more. Opening those doors to those landowners. Information from Joe Farmer to
I just emailed Mark and Patrick and was like, I want to learn more about this. I think I have members who would be really fit for this. And you guys were just amazing, really welcoming, and got me involved in the Agroforestry working group as well. So I think just continuing to have that open communication is wonderful, and especially as we to develop more projects and develop more resources, just continuing to have the working group as a hub of information for people to come and learn more. I think we're all recognizing that education at this moment for this topic in particular is really pertinent, both our side and the technician side. So definitely that piece is great. Yeah, I don't know anything else on that piece.
Yeah, one thing that I think could make a really good difference is getting that flow of agroforestry info going towards the legislators and funding agencies, so that, kind of the theme that I've been going on is that uphill battle with some of our partners, really great partners, but it's an uphill battle, and to convince them of the importance of these integrated systems. And so being able to develop materials that do outreach, that speak in the language of what some of the legislators care about, whether it's climate farming or salmon recovery, or and being able to highlight agroforestry can be such a dynamic tool in the toolbox for addressing so many of these priorities, not only around climate and environment, but also the food security issues and regional security around. I think that would be a really great way each with a lot of our partners, so that all of a sudden we might start to see interest trickling down to us from those larger halls of power, and then we can capitalize on that rather than continue to try to push uphill against it.
I like that point. That's really good. And in the Sustainable Farms and Fields bill, agroforestry is funded specifically through that bill. So that's an area of funding within Washington State that we can all start to tap into as money gets put into that bill. I'm really excited about working with more conservation districts around agroforestry. When I started working with agroforestry, I don't know, years ago, I didn't have a lot of colleagues and stuff to reach out to, and started to reach out. And now more and more, I think more and more landowners are becoming interested. People know what the term is now. And having more people in different conservation districts starting to work on this is great. I think a network of professionals where we have actual trained agroforesters in some of these institutions like NRCS, where there's still, we have a lot of people working in agroforestry, but it's very hard to find an agroforester hired into a role still in many institutions. And that's NRCS, that's, at all kinds of different levels. So I think getting some of that expertise into some of these institutions would be great for a region, getting those practices on the ground, and then having just a good network where all these different institutions can share knowledge, can talk to legislators, can figure out what the definition of silvopasture is and those types of things. I think there's so much potential and so much work still to do. And integrating all these different professional spaces that work with landowners that implement these practices. Even, places like our climate centers and stuff like that, right? Agroforestry with the Nature Conservancy, right? All these institutions that are also looking at, natural climate solutions. Agroforestry rises to the top when you start looking at natural climate solutions. So even institutions like that are looking towards and trying to fund these types of solutions, I think would also great to be interacting with and bringing to the fold as well.
To play off of that, Society of American Foresters is a huge professional association for forestry professionals. And, they're also getting into the agroforestry field as well. So, tapping into those kind of networks where they may have opportunities to work where we can't, and we may have opportunities to work where they can't, and providing that exchange of information and, what's working, what's not, I think is also a great place to be. And, maybe that's the next step after we, get organized and we, approach these other people with, here's what we know and what do you guys know, and let's talk about it. I also, through the Sustainable Farms and Fields, that's a great funding opportunity. But I'd like to see more, joint applications for that, so we can all, officially work together to do this, because, we can't, our districts are funded, we can't work unless we have money, and we can't have these conversations without that funding there, let alone be implementing. So that's kind of there for us.
I'm not sure if I'm going to say anything new or different, but yeah, I'll paraphrase again. Yeah, really driving it home. But I do think agroforestry is inherently interdisciplinary. I mean, it's just, it's not, the reason we don't have a lot of agroforesters is because it takes a lot. You have to combine a lot of knowledge, and we do need more of those people. But for the time being, interagency cooperation is really critical. We do, I mean, CDs and WSU Extension and NRCS and DNR, I think too, especially around forestry stuff. I've always had a longstanding MOA of like how we work together and operate and feed landowners. I really see Extension's role as often being kind of the first stop, because we do education and outreach, we attract a lot of people, and then I get to feed them on your way so they can actually get stuff done on the ground. But the CDs also have educational objectives, and so being able to work together and build off of that, because we are all grant funded, we are all understaffed and stretched thin, so we need to support each other. That's really key. And the Agroforestry Working Group is just such a great place to bring everyone to the table and create a shared language. That shared language is, I think if we can't all get a definition of silvopasture for Washington in the next 5 years, I mean, come on, what are we doing? And two, so we can tap into sort of longer, more stable sources of funding like EQIP and CSP, which can be used. If you ask anyone in RCS, they say, yes, we can fund agroforestry, but it doesn't get through the finish line very often because they're not necessarily competitive, and because there's restrictions around that funding and what that can look like. And I know in other states, they've done a really good job of being able to carve out special funding for agroforestry. I would love to do that here, but it does start with that shared language and with getting all these professionals at the table and interagency agreements.
I have a few more questions, but this will be an excellent time to ask if there's any questions.
And no, I was not going to use the microphone. I'm just kind of if there's ever been any interest or approach from like forestry community or like timber companies as an alternative timber harvest. We live, there's a lot of clear cutting and then herbicides and herbicides and herbicides and herbicides. There is probably a good livestock grazing solution. Chat, so there are trees that have less competition, and they however small the timber company, I don't know if it'd be worth it for them, but just that angle of it.
They were responsible. Probably you.
Make sure you, yeah, I mean, I think it would be really cool to experiment with, but especially for industry, they just have that streamlined down to like a penny, right? What's most efficient, and spraying is just such a cheap and effective option for controlling growth that it would be a big hurdle to overcome and try to convince someone to pay for the fencing for one alone for something like protecting trees in that context would be really difficult. But I do love the idea of exploring other options like that. I mean, even cover cropping, seeding something in that's beneficial to wildlife. Because that herbicide, that spraying really does, there's a lack of early cereal habitat. Now I'm really putting my forestry hat on, but there's a real lack of early cereal habitat in Washington state. We talk a lot about the lack of old growth, but early forest is also incredibly lacking because we spray that brush and that growth down, which is really good for pollinators, birds, you know, even mammals, etc. So, I mean, I agree with you, something needs to be done, but working with industry is hard when it's it's a dollar bill thing. So, did you have anything to add?
Sure.
Even if it was like a lease situation, you know, I know there's been technology, maybe you mentioned it with like the what do they call it? Basically like the fences using GPS technology.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah.
Maybe there would be a way to
As new tech develops, maybe.
Virtual fencing.
virtual fencing.
Experimental and cost prohibitive because you have to do radio inventories, build radio towers where it's like $60 a head, user subscription, but it's like as emerging technology, absolutely.
Got that last word.
Yeah, so as far as outreach from industry, we haven't seen a lot of that, but we do get inquiries from forest landowners that are interested in, especially like diversification of income. That's a big one. We get a lot of questions about non-timber forest products, and a lot of that's just finding the markets that are available and, you know, whether those are viable, it's definitely a lot of work, and there's a lot of that workload question on like who's going to be doing the harvesting, what do we need to do in the meantime to make sure that's a sustainable crop to keep going on throughout the years. A lot of it's also complicated by intergenerational transfer. So, you know, having a forest plan is one thing and that can help, but then there's the addition of the legacy plan of who's going to continue that forest system and who's going to be, you know, do the heirs of that property want to continue doing that? If they don't, then that's kind of a lot of work to put that over to that kind of system and then just let it all go after they pass that along. So, but we do get interest about that. So it's kind of, you know, customizing the plans into what the landowners are interested in, and what's going to be something that they can and still reach a lot of their forest objectives.
Now, one thing that's interesting with the commercial timberlands that there is that big agroforestry component for harvesting permits for mushrooms and for salal. And so there's been markets developed where there's large scale harvesting of non-timber forest products, which is pretty cool. It's just worked its way into the sort of harvest regime for the commercial timberlands. And so it's private, the small timber landowners have, you may not be able to have a scale harvest of salal or mushrooms to tap into those markets in a lucrative way, but there's, I think that's sort of our role, is working with the private, the small private landowners on some of those different alternatives that may not be feasible timber landowner, but it's feasible on the smaller scale. So it's providing those resources for the market scale. I think is an interesting distinction for the people working in this to work on.
We are at time, but I thought I would give each of you an opportunity to either answer this question or just come up with your own closing remarks as far as the next steps. So you can either answer this question, which is what do conservation districts, extension employees, employee need in adoption in the state, or if that's a question that's a little bit above and beyond. What are your thoughts about next steps for agroforestry? All right.
Well, I think continuing the build out of this Agroforestry Northwest resource and sort of the regional hubs that we've kind of, I see that as a really valuable next step. You know, this conference track is really great to gin up conversation, get people to know each other. And yeah, so I'm excited about all the work that's been done to date and the distribution across the state of interest and hopefully getting those regional work groups, regional sites, research sites that can continue to galvanize work would be really.
I think that, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Savannah Institute in the Midwest, which has kind of become a big agroforestry center in the Midwest and really nationally, I would argue, probably the National Agroforestry Center, and all kinds of folks hold conferences with them and do all kinds of resource production and all kinds of stuff. And they're great for the Midwest. I would love to see something like that be eventually created for the Pacific Northwest, where, and you know, I would say that what they've been able to create there in the Midwest is they're really a good national voice for agroforestry. And they are tapped in to the policy level in those regulatory levels and they're tapped into the funding levels. That's where I would love to see agroforestry go in our region. And they started out very similarly to this, I would say, just a collective of a few folks that were interested in agroforestry, sort of pushing that rock up the hill over the years. And so I think it would be great to start to tap in, like you mentioned, to the policy and regulatory level, because that can actually get in our way a lot of times. And I think we do this by continuing to collaborate, by collaborating on funding and collaborating on projects and working at more regional scales, right? Sort of pushing our boundaries and getting out of our respective counties or districts and working across lines with each other and really starting to share resources and collaborate on building it out.
I think to follow up on kind of the funding things, I think we also need to look at improving capacity. Districts, where every district kind of has its own assembly of professionals working together. And, sometimes maybe they're missing a forester specifically. Or a specific agroforestry professional or another person like that who can come in and fill that knowledge gap. So I think, bringing more people in and the funding to have those positions filled so that we can have as much knowledge available on the ground for people to talk to, and if they're interested. That communication channel needs to be there for that to be successful. And just a plug is that Mark and I are going to be talking about, Mark Mead, our forestry program.
I guess reiterating again. I guess I want to touch on what Carrie said earlier about we all know we need capacity. I mean, WSU needs capacity, CD needs capacity, NRCS needs, we all need capacity, but we don't just need more people, we need more agroforesters. I always joke Carrie's the only agroforester I know, because she really is the one of the few people with that actual title. We need people that are doing this like day in and day out, and really be able to dedicate their time to not just promoting adoption, but perfecting the craft. And so we do need CD people doing that. We also need university people doing that and dedicating, really valuable research assets to this and figuring out through peer review what works and what doesn't. That takes a lot of time. So I'm really hoping that over time that will happen, and we'll have more people with agroforestry titles. I think it's a small thing in on paper, but it would really mean a lot in practice.
And it legitimizes it more, right?
Right.
When
Yeah.
you don't see anyone who's an agroforester, well, what is that then? Right? Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add quickly, we've talked a lot about how we're lacking, capacity, funding is really challenging, and I would just really encourage anyone who thinks they might have an opportunity to go for a project like this to still chase after it, because it is totally possible, and to think really creatively about how to speak about the projects and bring them to your funders. CD folks are all really good at wearing multiple hats and changing the way that we talk about the work that we do depending on who we're speaking. And I found that in particular really critical in projects where we're working at those intersections really intensely. And the ability to, be creative. Is it riparian? Is it forestry? Is it just pure landowner incentive? I've had success with that, where it's if you're building a package for a grant for and the funders are, it's falling through, it's not enough benefit in one of the other categories, say, gonna get off the ground because the landowner is gonna pull out unless we can do this element, and that can work. So I would just say, be creative, be persistent, it's totally possible, and yeah, just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's pretty much covered next step. Just helps when, obviously, as a farm planner, being able to identify a resource concern and having these different PMPs in my tool.
All right, well, I'd like to thank all the panelists for your expertise and your time, and audience, we can give a round of applause. Share and show doubles.
It's hungry. Is it lunch?
It is lunch.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, guys.